parents have eaten one. Your grandparents ate one too. Right now, in this exact second, somewhere on this planet, a hamburger is being flipped on a grill, wrapped in paper, and handed to someone who has no idea they are holding one of the strangest, most contested, most quietly world-changing objects in human history. 2 pieces of bread. A disc of ground meat. That is all it looks like. But this simple sandwich has survived empires, wars, disease outbreaks, lawsuits, and 100 years of arguing over who actually invented it. Nobody fully agrees on where it came from. Nobody agrees on who made the first one. And yet somehow, this humble food managed to conquer almost every country on earth. By the end of this story, you will never look at a burger the same way again. Think about how strange that is. We trust hamburgers with our everyday lives without ever asking where they came from. We eat them at birthday parties, at drive-thrus at midnight, at backyard cookouts in the summer heat. They show up in movies, in songs, in memes, in the logos of some of the biggest companies ever built. A hamburger is one of the only foods on the planet that almost every culture has adopted and then made its own. In Japan, they add teriyaki sauce. In India, they replace the beef with spiced potato. In France, they melt fancy cheese on top and call it gourmet. This little sandwich crossed oceans and outlived wars, and almost nobody stops to ask how. If you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind the food we eat every day, make sure to subscribe, because every week we uncover the incredible stories hiding behind ordinary things. Before we go further, tell me this: what is your favorite burger? Classic cheeseburger? Something spicy? Or a wild combination nobody else would ever order? Let me know in the comments. Now let's go back. Not 100 years, not 200 years. Let's go back almost 800 years, to a place with no bread, no ketchup, and definitely no drive-through window. In the 13th century, warriors on horseback thundered across the plains of Central Asia. These were the Mongols and the related Tatar tribes, and they were building one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean almost to the edge of Europe. War moves fast, and there is no time to cook a proper meal when you are riding for days without stopping to rest. So these horsemen came up with something clever. They took tough scraps of meat, often from their own pack animals, chopped them into small pieces, and carried them tucked beneath their saddles as they rode. The movement of the horse and the weight of the rider pressed down on the meat for hours at a time, tenderizing it far better than any knife could. By the time they finally stopped to eat, the meat was soft enough to chew raw, sometimes mixed with a little salt or crushed spice to cut the taste. It sounds brutal. It sounds almost impossible to believe that anyone would choose to eat this way. But remember, these were soldiers on the move, not chefs in a kitchen. Survival mattered more than presentation, and in a strange, roundabout way, this desperate battlefield shortcut became the very first ancestor of the burger patty. Interestingly, some food historians actually trace an even earlier cousin of this idea back to ancient Rome, where cooks were already baking a seasoned beef patty mixed with pine nuts, pepper, and wine, centuries before the Mongols ever rode into battle. History rarely moves in a single straight line, and the burger's roots may reach back even further than most people realize. When the Mongols pushed westward and eventually reached the region we now call Russia, they brought this method of eating with them. Local Russians watched, adapted, and made the dish their own, mincing raw beef and sometimes topping it with a raw egg yolk and chopped onion. Today, we call that dish steak tartare, named directly after the Tatars themselves, a small linguistic fossil hiding in plain sight on modern restaurant menus. But that was only the beginning. This raw meat dish did not stay in Russia. It traveled, the way so much of history travels, through trade. Merchant ships moved back and forth between Russian ports and the busy German port city of Hamburg, carrying grain, timber, and goods across the Baltic and North Seas. Sailors carried more than cargo on those long voyages. They carried recipes, tucked away in memory, passed from crew to crew, from kitchen to kitchen. And when steak tartare finally reached Hamburg, the Germans did something new with it. They started cooking it. This is where the story takes its first major turn. By the 18th century, German cooks in Hamburg were taking minced beef, mixing it with onions, breadcrumbs, salt, and pepper, shaping it into a thick patty, and cooking it on a hot pan. It became a favorite among dock workers and sailors, the kind of hearty, affordable meal that kept working people fueled through long, hard days at the port. This dish eventually earned a name that stuck. They called it Hamburg steak, after the city where it became famous. Picture it, steam rising off a hot iron pan, the smell of onions and browning beef drifting through a crowded harbor kitchen. No bun, no lettuce. Just a thick seasoned patty of meat, eaten with a knife and fork like any other proper dinner. For decades, that is all it was. A single regional dish, tied to a single city, completely unknown to most of the world. There was no sandwich yet, no sesame seed bun, no pickles, just a hearty slab of seasoned meat, served on a plate the same way you might serve any other cut of beef. If you had shown a Hamburg dockworker in the year 1750 what a modern hamburger looks like, he would not have recognized it at all. But dishes, like people, do not stay in one place forever. And an entire ocean was about to open up. Then, in 1848, everything changed for Germany, and by extension, for this humble steak. That year, waves of political revolution swept across the German states. People rose up, demanding more rights, more freedom, and change their governments were not ready to give. When those uprisings failed, hundreds of thousands of Germans decided they had seen enough. They packed up their lives and sailed for a new country that promised opportunity, the United States. Historians call this wave of immigrants the 48ers, and they were just the beginning. Through the 1850s, the German-born population in America exploded, arriving by the boatload into cities like New York, Cincinnati, and Chicago. And what did they bring with them, tucked into memory and tradition, if not their food? Hamburg steak crossed the Atlantic in the minds and hands of these immigrants. Street vendors near the docks of New York began advertising steak cooked in the Hamburg style to attract German sailors and dock workers who missed a taste of home. Slowly, quietly, without anyone realizing it, the pieces of the modern hamburger were falling into place on American soil. But here is where the story gets messy. Here is where historians still argue today. Because somewhere between that flat, knife and fork Hamburg steak and the sandwich you can hold in one hand, somebody put that meat patty between two pieces of bread, and almost nobody agrees on who did it first. In New Haven, Connecticut, there is a small lunch counter called Louis' Lunch, still standing over a century later. The story goes that in the year 1900, a customer rushed in, desperate for a fast meal he could eat on the go. The owner, Louis Lassen, is said to have taken a ground beef patty and placed it between two slices of toast. In the year 2000, the Library of Congress officially recognized Louis' Lunch as the birthplace of the hamburger, after a member of Congress championed the claim. But travel to Seymour, Wisconsin, and locals will tell you a very different story. But history was about to take an unexpected turn, because building an empire meant somebody else had to fight to take it down. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the biggest names in American fast food went to war with each other, and it got personal fast. Burger King mocked McDonald's relentlessly for its smaller, fried patties, boasting loudly about its own thicker, flame-broiled Whopper. McDonald's fired back with lawsuits over what it called misleading advertising claims. In one especially strange incident, a Burger King franchise owner in Florida displayed a life-sized figure of Ronald McDonald lying inside a coffin, a wooden stake through his chest, a message pinned beside him, joking that rival menu items had finally gotten him. Corporate offices on both sides scrambled to distance themselves from the stunt. Then, in 1984, an underdog named Wendy's launched an ad campaign that would become instantly unforgettable, featuring an elderly woman staring down a comically tiny burger patty lost inside an enormous bun, demanding, in a gravelly voice nobody who heard it could ever forget, to know exactly where the beef actually was. The phrase exploded across the entire country within weeks. It got repeated by candidates during the actual 1984 presidential campaign. It became a genuine piece of American pop culture, chanted at sporting events and printed on T-shirts. Burger King was forced to actually increase the size of its Whopper patty just to save face in the eyes of the public. This was not simply a food fight over lunch. This was full-blown corporate warfare, fought with billboards, jingles, and grills instead of weapons, and an entire generation of Americans watched it unfold on their television screens. And while American companies were busy fighting each other at home, the hamburger itself was quietly slipping across borders, heading somewhere far bigger than any one country. McDonald's alone eventually grew to serve customers in more than 100 countries, and something fascinating happened along the way. The hamburger did not just get exported, it got translated. In India, where many people do not eat beef for religious reasons, McDonald's created the Makaloo Tikki, a burger built around a spiced potato patty instead of meat. In Japan, teriyaki sauce found its way onto the bun. In parts of the Middle East, Macarabia sandwiches wrapped seasoned meat in flatbread instead of a traditional roll. The hamburger had become something remarkable, a format flexible enough to absorb almost any culture's flavors while still remaining, somehow, unmistakably itself. But conquering the world came with a heavy price, and that price would eventually put the hamburger on trial in the court of public opinion. By the early 2000s, rates of obesity and related health problems were climbing sharply across the United States, and fast food chains found themselves squarely in the spotlight, accused of playing a leading role in a genuine public health crisis. Critics pointed to the sheer number of calories, fat, and salt packed into a typical fast food meal, and to how aggressively these companies marketed directly to children, using bright colors, cartoon mascots, and toys tucked inside every kid's meal. Books and news reports dug into supersized portions, questioning why a single meal had ballooned to contain more food than an entire family dinner from just a few decades earlier. A documentary filmmaker even ate nothing but McDonald's food for 30 straight days on camera, agreeing to say yes if any employee offered to supersize his order. And audiences watched, stunned, as his own doctors reported his mood, his liver function, and his overall health rapidly declining in real time. Fast food chains, once celebrated purely as symbols of convenience and modern efficiency, now had to answer difficult, uncomfortable questions about what they were actually doing to the people eating their food every single day, sometimes multiple times a week. The industry did not collapse under the pressure. It adapted, the way it had adapted so many times before. Salads and grilled options appeared on menus that had once sold nothing but burgers and fries. Calorie counts started showing up, printed right next to the prices on menu boards, a legal requirement in many places. Portion sizes were quietly reconsidered, and at the very same time, in a completely different direction, a new kind of burger culture was rising, one built not around speed or apology, but around pride. Small, independent burger restaurants began popping up across cities, competing over who could source the best quality beef, grind it fresh in-house every single morning, and stack it with inventive, unexpected toppings like fried eggs, caramelized onions, or exotic sauces borrowed from other cuisines entirely. Regional favorites like In-N-Out built passionate, almost obsessive fan followings simply by focusing on quality over sheer size or speed, keeping their menu deliberately small and their ingredients deliberately fresh. Chefs at high-end restaurants started putting their own signature burgers on the menu, sometimes priced at $20 or $30, wrapped in confidence rather than embarrassment. The hamburger, once judged purely by how fast it could be served, was now being celebrated as a genuine, respectable art form in its own right, discussed and debated with the same seriousness people once reserved for fine wine or gourmet cooking. The same food that had once been dismissed as cheap and disposable was now capable of anchoring an entire fine dining menu. And just when it seemed like the hamburger's story might finally be settling down, one more twist arrived, and this one questioned the very meat sitting at its center. Companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat began engineering plant-based patties designed to sizzle, bleed, and taste remarkably close to real beef, using ingredients like soy, peas, and rice, reworked at the molecular level to mimic the fat and texture of ground meat. This was not simply a vegetarian option tucked quietly into the corner of a menu. It was aimed squarely at meat eaters themselves, at customers worried about their health, about animal welfare, or about the environmental cost of raising cattle on a warming planet. Burger King was the first major chain to take the leap, launching its Impossible Whopper nationwide in 2019, cooked on the very same grills as its beef burgers. McDonald soon followed with its own McPlant burger, developed alongside Beyond Meat, and tested first overseas before arriving in the United States. Almost overnight, the companies that had spent a century building their entire identity around beef were now racing each other to sell burgers with no beef in them at all. It was, in its own strange way, one more chapter in the burger wars, fought this time not over patty size, but over the very definition of meat itself. After more than 100 years, the hamburger was reinventing itself once again, proving it could survive absolutely any change the future decided to throw at it. So here we are, back where we started, a piece of ground meat between two pieces of bread. It sounds so simple, but you now know the truth. This sandwich survived a Mongol empire, crossed an ocean, escaped a wave of public panic over its own safety, got fought over by dozens of small-town cooks who all wanted credit for inventing it, sparked corporate wars, fought with jingles and lawsuits, and adapted itself to fit nearly every culture on Earth, from spiced potato patties in India to plant-based patties designed for a future without cattle at all. No other food has traveled quite this far, changed quite this much, and still somehow remained so completely recognizable. That is why the hamburger is not really just food. It is a mirror. It reflects immigration and ambition, industry and innovation, health and greed, tradition and reinvention, all pressed together between two simple pieces of bread. The next time you hold one in your hands, you are not just holding a meal, you are holding 800 years of human history. If you learned something new today, do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone who has no idea how deep the story behind their favorite burger really goes.